I think one of the important things to realise in all this is that the arguments really go back to the classical world in one regard. The arguments are always the same. It's why they're used, by whom, when and for what purpose.
And every generation thinks they're using the arguments anew.
There's nothing new under the sun.
Hello there, welcome to Rational Religion, where we make sense of spirituality. Today we're here in London in Great Peter Street at a think tank called Theos, which examines the place of religion in society. We have a very special guest. He's a senior fellow here. His name's Nick Spencer. He's a historian and an author of multiple books, including Atheists, The Origin of the Species, which charts the rise of atheism over the last 500 years or so in the West. Nick has also had a three-part series recently on BBC Radio, looking at the conflict or not between science and religion in the West. So Nick, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin, not right at the beginning, but actually in the modern day. Let's talk about new atheism. What is it and where did it come from?
The term originates probably about 2004, I think it is, and it was used and it has been used to describe public atheists who are quite noisy about their atheism. Some would say aggressive, others would say just assertive. Yeah. It's tied in with a number of the geopolitical issues of the time. I think that's an important factor that's sometimes lost in the mix, but the focus was on the rationality, or as they would say it, the irrationality of religious belief.
Okay, and what were some of those factors that really led it to rise up in the way that it did? Because it sort of took over the culture for a long time.
Yeah, it did. It's important to say that the advocates of new atheism would simply say they were just being atheists. They were just stating the case against God, or the case against religion, or the case against the supernatural. They were deploying reason, so on and so forth. They would not see anything new about it, nor would they say anything particularly kind of historically distinctive. Most other people, those who weren't actually sort of advocates of new atheism themselves, noticed not new arguments, but certainly a new tonal difference. Yeah. And that, I think, came from the fact that, well, put it this way. In 1968, a sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, wrote an editorial in the New York Times in which he said, by the 21st century, religions will be isolated sects huddled together to avoid a worldwide secular culture. It didn't turn out like that. Yeah. And in the first decade of the 21st century, you obviously have 9/11. You have George W. Bush, president, openly, publicly evangelical Christian, as president of the United States. These big geopolitical factors are tangled up with religion, and new atheism was a reaction against that, a reaction against the prevalence, the prominence, and sometimes the violence of religion in contemporary public life.
Okay. I think the defining feature for most people is its reliance on science and scientific arguments, treating God as a scientifically testable hypothesis and saying the evidence doesn't stack up. Is that something that's new, or is that something that's a bit older?
There's a long history of doing that. The history of science and religion is not one of antagonism, certainly not one of dominant antagonism that it's popularly believed to be. But that doesn't mean there haven't been scientific antagonists in the past who have argued with various different logics and evidence bases that science, whatever that exactly means, disproves religion or God, whatever they mean. So the idea that you can disprove science and religion through God is actually a very old one. The current formulation of it, or the one that was probably most prevalent in the new atheists, was through evolutionary science. Yeah. And that is a more modern thing. Historically, you might get things like the mechanization of the human body, or the mechanization of the universe, or behaviorism or Freudianism, yeah, as scientific arguments against religion, less so evolution, although there were some. What's unusual, I think, in more modern times is the way that evolution or Darwinism became weaponized for an atheistic cause.
You mentioned part of your thesis is also that this dichotomy, this apparent dichotomy in the argument that science is against religion seems to pop up first with John William Draper's book, I think towards the end of the 19th century, and then it was banned by the Vatican. Are those the kind of arguments that John William Draper relied on rather than utilising evolution?
Yes. Draper was a chemist, and it's probably fair to say not a brilliant historian. He was also wedded to conflict metaphors in a lot of his writing. He, interestingly, was present in the famous Oxford debate in 1860 between Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley, which was supposed to be this iconic evolutionary theistic moment. Interestingly, though, he doesn't mention that, and he doesn't really major that much on evolution. It's an issue. The bigger issue for him is the lawfulness of creation. And actually, in many ways, this is the most historic argument. In one way, it goes all the way back to Aristotle and certainly the use of Aristotle in the Abbasid Caliphate and then in medieval Europe. If the universe is perfectly lawful, what space is there for God? And that probably underlines what Draper says more than anything else. His is a very long historical analysis, so it takes lots of different angles, but the lawfulness of creation, which interestingly is used by some believers to legitimise belief in God, is used by him against belief in God.
So he takes the laws of nature as eternal and as the starting point and says and takes them out of the mix from a creative power.
Yes, well, it's partly that, but it's more that if the laws of nature are pre-existent and absolute, what space is there for God?
It's funny because that is exactly a kind of discussion that was happening with a particular sect, a very militant and very missionary sect in India towards the turn of the 19th century called the Arya Samaj, who argued that there were pre-existing laws of nature and that the creator was simply an assembler of matter rather than the originator of it. And this led to a strain of atheism within Indian subculture that what need is there for God then? And it's something that the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he wrote on that, especially in the early part of his books, he wrote on that especially about that question.
Because there's a separation between the laws and the lawgiver, as a sort of, saying that one can exist without the other. But that is interesting about what you talk about John William Draper, because he did that, and he also, you say in your book, he kind of, or him and White, I think, in a sense invented this narrative that there is a conflict between science and religion, and that really gained a lot of currency, despite perhaps its actual historical accuracy. I mean, is that fair? That
is fair. I guess the best way of putting it is that they had a selective reading of history through a particular lens. Yeah. In one sense, all historians do that, but it was more intentional in their instance. Yeah. The last third of the 19th century is the period in which science and religion do come closest to being an actual kind of war, an actual war. And historically, there have been lots of examples of clerics, for example, in Europe, speaking out against certain scientific developments. Most famously, of course, you have the Galileo trial of the 1630s. What Draper and White do is normalise those moments of conflict and tell a story that treats them as the basis. There's scholarship being done recently which strongly suggests actually they have a slightly more subtle approach than that, and they're not antagonistic to religion altogether, but just certain types of religion. But be that as it may, they are responsible for these very substantial articulations of a continuous narrative which is controlled by the idea of warfare.
On the other hand, do you think it would be fair to say no, it wasn't warfare, it was harmony for centuries?
No.
Where would you stand?
Well, we had this discussion when making the programme, and I've been thinking about it for quite a while, and I was actually giving a paper on it at a conference in Birmingham just a couple of weeks or so ago. Scholarship has moved in this area in the last 40 years or so, away from conflict. And the most favoured thesis, not a metaphor itself, but thesis at the moment is John Hedley Brooks' complexity thesis, which simply says, as you would expect, the relationship between the two is complex. It certainly hasn't been the case of pure harmony.
Is that a thesis? Surely that's
probably call anything that.
That's a description of a...
Well, I mean, in retrospect, it looks like a statement of the obvious, but you have to remember that at the time, the controlling metaphor was warfare. And apart from anything else, what John and Peter Harrison have also done is pointed out that the terms science and religion are relatively modern terms. Yeah. They cover a multitude of different factors to essentialise each of them, and then to essentialise the relationship between them.
To define them against each other.
Yeah, define, there is such a thing as science, and there is such a thing as religion, and then these two entities are in such a thing as conflict with one another. You're simplifying it every single stage along the journey. The problem is that its complex is not as compelling a message as its war. It's a complete mistake to go to the other extreme and to replace one simplistic metaphor with another, harmony, but it leaves you with this really challenging approach. Well, how do we describe it then? How do we encapsulate it? And I talk a little bit about this in the BBC series, and we might come on to it. But you know, there have been periods of greater harmony, periods of greater tension, and it depends on the particular period of time and the scientific discipline, and also the character of the religion at the time, to depend on which is which.
If we talk about Western Europe, and we say instead of science and religion, we say scientists and religious people, outspoken religious people, how would you track that development, sort of from the Renaissance onwards? You know, in summary, I know that's basically the thesis of your book, but you know, roughly, what were the trends, the major trends?
What a big question. Here's an indicative point. The word scientist is only coined in 1834. Now, clearly, people we refer to before then, we would think of as scientists, but the word didn't exist. They were natural philosophers, or natural theologians, some of them, and that points to the fact that, say, from the Reformation period onwards, you had mathematicians, astronomers, natural philosophers, natural theologians, who are engaged in the rational and sometimes empirical investigation of the natural world. The vast majority of them, I'll come on to one exception in a moment, were not only believers, but saw harmony between what they discovered in the natural world and what they believed. As the famous metaphor puts it, God has two books, the book of words and the book of works, Scripture, the Bible, and the creation, and the two are harmonious. You engage with them in different ways, but they're harmonious. The exception is in France in the 18th century, where science is first weaponized against religion, but it's done so primarily, I would argue, because the intellectual, ecclesiastical, social and political culture of 18th century France is much more oppressive. And whereas in Britain you have Newton, eccentric but very pious believer, as the kind of the intellectual light at the time, Newtonianism in Britain becomes a foundation for religion. In France it's a threat to religion. And so you get certain thinkers, none of whom have the stature of Newton by any means, but who begin to weaponize science against religion. So for the most part, scientists are believers, or at least deists, and indeed the majority of British scientists in the 18th century would have been clerics themselves. Or no, not majority, but a lot of them would have been. But in France, because the culture is different, the relationship is different.
I mean, I absolutely love part of what you brought out in one of your talks at LICC, which was, and I'm sure you mentioned other places as well, that the first, out-and-out atheist was a cleric whose manuscript is only found, underneath his bed after his death. And it made, I think you put it, it made the God delusion seem entirely reasonable, calm and, rationalistic approach to religion.
That's right. John Meslier's Testament, it's a work of considerable anger.
That was a historian's review, very considered.
And the interesting thing was, it was known at the time, and it was picked up, and Voltaire published a version of it. But Voltaire hated atheists almost as much as he hated Catholics. Voltaire was a deist, and he turned Meslier into a deist. So he retained its viciously anti-clerical and in many ways anti-Jewish elements, cleared away the atheism, and inserted a deistic kind of a belief in a natural first cause God into it. So Meslier was known, but the true severity of his criticism, in fact, it wasn't just anti-clerical. There was a lot of anti-clericalism at the time, but it was actually atheistic. Wasn't known until much, much later.
Well, that is interesting that someone like Voltaire is rebelling against the religious context that he's in, but also retaining some general belief in God. What was the reaction to these? I'll group them as Enlightenment skeptics. I'm not sure that really makes sense, but you know, there were these people who seemed to have those kind of views. What were the Enlightenment skeptics' views on Christianity, specifically including Trinity, the resurrection, justification through faith alone?
The first response to that is that there is a spectrum of these Enlightenment radicals. And so there isn't a single kind of response they have. On one end, you would get the most vigorously anti-Christian and indeed, obviously anti-clerical, but anti-God thinkers. So someone like Baron de Holbach would probably be the best example of this, who can have no truck with any form of religious belief, creed whatsoever. And there are others like him, like La Mettrie is a physician who writes an extraordinary book called Man and Machine, which is published in about 1750 or so, which effectively argues that, as you kind of expect from the title, that humans are nothing but machines, and that cuts the ground away from morality, mind, will, soul, God, religion. So you get really radical things like that. Then a bit less radical, you get people like Diderot, who is probably an atheist, at least at the end of his life, but flirts with deism. What unites these groups is that they see specific Christian creeds as superstitious nonsense. So the Trinity it makes no sense and is anyway made up after the scriptures. Well, miracles are very hard to credit, although it's actually Hume, of course, who gives the most kind of cogent argument against miracles. So they agree on the falsity and sometimes the absurdity of specific creedal claims, but they disagree on whether there is anything more deistic, abstract about the possibility of a first cause behind them.
What was the response of those radicals to Islam, even though they may have had limited understanding of it? How do they treat Islam similarly or differently to how they treated Christianity?
Well, you're right, firstly, they had much less understanding of it. Secondly, and this is very important, Islam was out there. They lived under a Catholic regime in France. So one was knowledge of at second hand, and the other was experience of. And that possibly underlies a common but not universal reaction that Islam was more intellectually robust and also intellectually freer than the circumstances in which they lived. So sometimes the philosophers would, as it were, weaponize Islam against the Catholic regime in which they lived. They didn't know, it was a very ahistorical and actually quite an ill-informed weaponization, but it was used by some at least to attack the intellectually oppressive culture in which they lived.
And I remember they also, a lot of the secularists looked at the example of the Ottomans and said, they seem to permit, because they had such a big kingdom, they seem to permit all these different religions, and here in their country, for instance, their political leaders weren't doing the same, and they would kind of make that comparison to try and embarrass their leaders.
Yes, I mean, embarrass is a nice way of putting it. I think they were trying more than embarrassing them, they were absolutely shaming them. But again, we come back to this critical point of the extent to which there's intellectual freedom there. And I think it's very telling that in many ways, in the 18th century, Britain can boast two of the most sceptical minds in Europe, Edward Gibbon and David Hume. And yet neither of them come out as atheists, neither of them are atheists. And I think one of the reasons for that is that they're not really pushed to atheism by the culture in which they live. They certainly come under a lot of attack, of course they do. But they live, broadly speaking, in a comparatively intellectually tolerant milieu, and they don't have, as it were, an aggressively, narrowly Christian culture to get their teeth into. So much of this, it depends on, effectively, if systems can't bend, they break. And they could bend in 18th century Britain. That was much more brittle in 18th century France.
And that's so interesting because all those names you gave, those French thinkers, Lemaitre and
Diderot and Holbach,
they are all French names. And you mentioned also, part of your thesis, that in the UK, atheism was much more, and when it did develop, it was much more of a working class phenomenon, and that it was related to the economic plight of people with free market capitalism, and the view that actually the church was aligned with the state and was actually indifferent to the needs of the many. And that is just so interesting that you do have the growth of atheism in the UK, but it's of a completely different nature. It's less intellectual, it's less philosophical, it's much more to do with the ordinary person.
That's right. It's a fascinating story. That the first person, British thinker you'd associate really prominently with atheism is probably Bertrand Russell in the 20th century. Even John Stuart Mill is a kind of a theist in the 19th century. You get this fascinating seesaw. So France erupts into revolution and then kind of Napoleonic conquest at the end of the 18th century. Britain finds itself at war with France for a whole generation. To be British was not to be French. And it had been for much of the 18th century, but even more at the beginning of the 19th century. Who do we blame for the barbarism into which France has degenerated? Well, it's the philosophes, isn't it? It's because these are the people who intellectually laid the groundwork for what happened in the 1790s. 1815, Britain comprehensively conquers or finishes off Napoleon, but in the post-Napoleonic period, you have a reassertion of quite rigid political authority, free market capitalism, which is a slightly anachronistic way of putting it, liberalism is economic liberalism, I think, asserts itself as dominant in the 1820s and 30s. This is a period of obviously urbanisation and industrialisation, and it is all marked with the imprimatur of the established church, which only very reluctantly begins to unpeel its fingers from political authority in the 1820s and 1830s. In other words, the same causes that provoked atheism in 18th century France are actually present in 19th century Britain, but there's a class element built into it, and that's one of the reasons why at first atheism, in as far as it's a movement at all, is much more of a working class phenomenon than it was in France. But, and here's another little twist, it's never a fully working class phenomenon because the level of religious toleration that has been built into the British, English and then British political system from the 17th century means that you get Christians, primitive Methodists for example, who are there amongst the working class in the urban areas. And there's a famous thesis that Britain never underwent the same kind of revolution as many European countries did in 1848 because of Methodism. Now, I think that's pushing it a bit far. So you get this atheist working class reaction in the 19th century, but even that is tempered with the fact that there are Christians there who are showing a different face to Christianity than people were seeing through the Anglican Church. So
let me just get this clear in my mind. So really what you're talking about is the fact that actually atheism began as a strand in France as a reaction to the church state, as it were. But what really underpinned that kind of the militant heresy bashing in France? Because you had the wars of religion which even preceded that in the 16th century, didn't you? and the
16th and
16th, 17th century. So that seems to be the very focal point and the very roots of it all, is those wars of religion.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, all of European history is conducted in the shadow of the 30 Years' War, which is conducted in the shadow of the Reformation. There are lots of different ways of looking at this. I suppose two are worth picking out. One is that...
Can we just clarify? So wars of religion is Catholic Protestant wars in Europe, right?
Yes, yeah, although...
Loosely, although they had major political dimensions rather than purely religious.
Exactly. So you would have Catholics siding with Protestants against Catholics and vice versa, depending on the dynastic machinations at the time.
And what are the timescales here? When did it begin? When did it end?
Well, so in one sense, it begins right from the 1520s. And obviously, the Reformation is dated to Martin Luther in 1517. There is violence, say, in the Peasants' War in Germany that breaks out in the middle of the 1520s or so. Protestantism begins to cohere right at the end of the 1520s. But for the majority of the first half of the 16th century, violence is relatively sporadic. It becomes a bit more substantial, but still quite localised in the second half of the 16th century. But it's really in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, that huge amounts of Europe, and particularly the area of the Holy Roman Empire, now called Germany, that is absolutely devastated and loses a third of its population, maybe even half its population. It's completely brutal, and it lasts for longer than a generation. So everything subsequently it takes place in the shadow of that. And so there are two factors going on here. One is that for 100 years or so now, Catholics have been throwing arguments trying to understand the Protestant position, and Protestants have been out throwing arguments to undermine the Catholic position. And they both did quite a good job at it. So 50 or 100 years later, early atheists pick up the arguments that the Catholics and Protestants had been using against each other earlier, and then use it against Christianity or religion altogether. So the arguments are born in the wars of religion, and then they're deployed subsequently. I think one of the important things to realise in all this is that the arguments really go back to the classical world in one regard. The arguments are always the same. It's why they're used, by whom, when, and for what purpose.
And every generation thinks they're using the arguments anew.
There's nothing new under the sun.
I mean, I see that with new atheism. You read the arguments like, no, like, man is a machine. That is an argument which is deployed with such, ferocity today.
Who designed the designer?
Who designed the design? These are common ones.
Okay, so let's pull some of these things together. So Europe was in the wake of these European wars of religion, Catholics versus Protestants, or sometimes together. But the macro picture was that a lot of people were fighting in the name of religion, causing a huge amount of bloodshed, and this must have really undermined the kind of the moral authority of religion, because a lot of the radicals in the past have said, well, if we get rid of religion, we won't have morality, whereas all these people are dying on the streets because of this. And at the same time, that conflict generated a lot of scriptural arguments between the Catholics and the Protestants, and then radicals later then took this with the moral authority of religion weakened, and then they got the intellectual arguments and they deployed it against Christianity. And especially that grew in areas where there was a political motive. So especially in France, where they were using this as a weapon against the authority of the state, which was linked to the church. A lot of those secularists and radicals, they kind of intimated that we would have kind of utopia, in a sense, if we had a fully scientific type of world where we got rid of religion, we rely purely on reason. And on the face of it, that seems to be what communism and what the USSR was. How did that bear out in reality?
How did that work out? Don't give any plot spoilers here. Well, one of the arguments from the book is that it was no good saying there is no God. If you live in a thickly religious culture where religion affects everything, and society, politics, economics, governance, everything is somehow dependent on the existence of God. There is no God has very limited appeal, because the challenge is to replace what you've got, not simply to pull it down. And the big fear for Europeans was, if you remove God, you remove just everything really that holds the structure up. So there is no God might be a tenable phrase in the seminar room, but in public life you have to say there is no God and therefore. And one of the arguments in the book is that the different radicals put different conclusions to that sentence. Right. So some would say there is no God and no heaven. therefore we need to build heaven on earth, which kind of translates ultimately into some sort of Marxist, communist, utopian type of response. There is no God, and therefore we need to maximise happiness on earth.
That's Bentham.
Utilitarianism. There is no God, and therefore we need to maximise pleasure on earth, which would be the kind of view that someone like Lemaitre, one of the most radical of philosophers, advocated. And there's also, although you don't get this for a long time, a nihilistic strain. There is no God, and therefore there is no purpose, so on and so forth, which you might kind of equate to a sort of Nietzschean strand, depending on how you read Nietzsche. So the best known of those is the first, because it generates massive social and political systems that at one point in the 20th century are governing a third of the world. But the point is that the link from A to B isn't a necessary one. There is no God, and therefore you get linked from A to B to C to D to E.
You get lots of gods.
You get lots of earthly gods. Some of the self, some of the society, some of pleasure.
And you talk about in your book about how it was a very missionary type of atheism that happened in the Soviet Union. You know, they were sort of saying, you know, science is our God, and they had these kind of slogans that you go through, you know, some things like science is your God, and they're also oppressing a lot of religious people. How did that sort of, what effect did that have on religion in the communist bloc, and what was the effect after the communist bloc fell?
So Russia is a very good example, as we were talking about earlier, of a system that didn't bend so it broke.
Right.
And as European countries are liberalising in the 19th century, Russia does so in only very piecemeal way, and a very autocratic system which is backed up by the orthodoxy in the early part of the 20th century explodes in 1917, as we know. The first belief is that we have established a socialist utopia and religion will die away. It doesn't. So in the 1920s, you gradually ratchet up the deliberate political attempts to eradicate religion. Sometimes it's done through the foundation of quasi-independent, although not really independent bodies, like the wonderfully named Soviet League of the Militant Godless. I knew how to name atheists.
I wonder what they're about.
Yeah. It's hard to tell, isn't it? That's right. Who would campaign and propagandise and have posters, like you say, the lovely post saying, defeat religion, we say study science.
Yeah.
And they would have alternative religious festivals. This is another thing we haven't even touched on, the way that atheism historically, repeatedly, has sought to replace religion, not simply by arguing against it, but by having different birth ceremonies and different death ceremonies.
Maybe the British Humanist Society are watching this interview.
There's a good precedent there. So they do those kind of things. They do work in as far as you have far fewer people going to church, let alone confessing their religion in the 1920s than did beforehand. But religion is still not eradicated, so there are actual purges alongside many other people who were purged in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. There's a slight reining back, obviously, because of the war, and Stalin draws in orthodox support in the war efforts, and a slight thaw in the 1950s, and then another period of aggressive anti-religious activity under Khrushchev in the 50s. But there is a statement attributed, I can't remember who it is, I mentioned in the book, in which at one point one of the Russian atheistic leaders says, religion is like a nail. The harder you hit it, the deeper it goes in. And that was why by the end of the 70s and into the 80s, there is a gradual thawing of anti-religious sentiment, and even people writing that perhaps it was possible to be religious at the same time as you're a communist. Because whereas, of course, vastly fewer people had any religious knowledge or practice in Russia in the mid-1970s than they would have done 50 or 60 years earlier, it still hadn't been eradicated. Fall of communism in the late 80s, early 90s sees this remarkable resurgence of Russian and other orthodoxies in the other side of the Iron Curtain. But I don't get quite as excited about that as some people do, because it is very much a nationalistic assertion over and against what went beforehand, rather than anything that's got profoundly to do with the gospel. It's not disconnected, but let's not confuse it with other kinds of religious revival.
Well, the picture that you've painted of European atheism and the growth of it, I see a lot of the same factors in the last 15 years or so, happening again. And I think, 9/11 was a real flashpoint for new atheism. And in a way, new atheism became, while old atheism, you could say, was a bulwark against Christianity. And it focused on Christianity, and it even weaponized Islam to use against the state, the church. In the modern era, because we have a globalized culture, you don't now point to the evils of the church in France as a state actor. Today, people point to Saudi Arabia, and so because of this globalized culture, now kind of so-called Islamic cultures, so-called Islamic states, which are theocratic, dictatorial, often backed by Western states historically as well. They are now the flashpoint of new atheism, and new atheism is now a weapon and being used, and those arguments of science are being deployed against Islam in particular. Is that something that you have recognised and you have seen, and you recognise it as happening in today's world?
Oh, without doubt. So if you were to want to pithily crystallise your atheistic arguments in France, middle of the 18th century, you might take the fact that there were still people being executed, indeed I think also being tortured for confessional crimes. In other words, for a crime against a Catholic state or Catholic people being executed. If you want any better reason why, at the very least, you should be anti-clerical, probably anti-Christian and maybe anti-God, that's your example. Nowadays, it is no accident that the popular atheist slogan of the last 15 years or so is, what is it, science flies people to the moon, religion flies people into buildings. Obviously, everyone knows what's going on there. That's your soundbite. That crystallises what science is capable of doing and what religion actually does. Now, like all soundbites, it doesn't bear a moment's exaggeration, but rhetorically, it's hugely powerful.
And where do you see things going in the West in particular in terms of belief? Do you think new atheism has completely won the day, or do you think there are other emerging trends now?
Well, new atheism has really faded, really. We were launched at Theos a month after the God Delusion was published, and for a good few years or so, this was everywhere, and it was the kind of the atmosphere in which we lived. What struck me, particularly when writing the book, and the book came out 5 years ago now, was how many atheists are determined to distance themselves from new atheism. I think it was the Rationalist or the Skeptics magazine, I can't remember which it was, had an editorial effectively entitled Richard Dawkins is a subject lesson on how not to do it. So I don't think new atheism has been successful in that regard. It has alienated as many people as it has attracted. The trends in the Western world are a growing disaffiliation for institutional religion, institutional Christianity, a growing embrace of atheism, not new atheism in that sense, but people just believe in God, but also a growing and certainly changing set of beliefs around what you might loosely call spirituality.
Spiritual, not religious.
Yeah, absolutely, that's the category.
Which we have a podcast video out.
Yeah, we do.
It's a growing topic, and you will find people who disparage any form of institutional, that's the bad word, institutional religious affiliation, but are much happier and even prepared to advocate for bespoke, ad hoc, personalised spiritual beliefs, which are tailored to my particular concerns. So in some ways, interestingly, where the debate 300 years ago between science and religion was actually just caught up, between religion and atheism, was caught up in the context of wars of religion, and that's what shaped it. Today, the same debate is caught up in these more pluralising, secularising trends. It's not a straightforward battle. It never is a straightforward battle one way or the other. It's always situated in the particular context of the moment.
And isn't it interesting, I think, that one thing that really struck me was how you talked about France and England and how to be English was not to be French because of the French-English wars. And that resulted in two different attitudes towards pluralism and people's different beliefs. In the UK, it was much more pluralistic. In France, it was much more intolerant of anti-Catholic views. And actually, you see those trends in the manifestation of secularism to this day between France and England. I mean, in France, you have the burqa ban, you have the swimsuit Muslim women wear?
Burkini.
The burkini ban, right? And you have legislation against it. And in England, that's not even really conceivable, actually, still to this day. So we're still feeling those repercussions.
Absolutely.
Centuries later.
That's right. Although the kind of the footnote to that is that the reason for France's laïcité is we haven't talked about France in the 19th century, and the pendulum swings between a more secular Republican state and a more royalist Catholic state in France in the 19th century. But you're right. You can trace it all the way back. The state of secularism today is really interesting. There's a book recently come out which I've not yet read, but I intend to, about struggles that secularism is having in Turkey and in India. We talked about France. In one sense, there are issues around it in America as well. It's partly because there are different kinds of secularism.
Yep.
There's what's sometimes called the programmatic secularism of France, in which secularism acts like a bouncer at a club, which says you're not coming in. And then
it acts as a state religion, actually.
Well, in many ways, yeah, that's right. But it's there to prevent the entrance of religious views, practices into public life. You have the procedural secularism, which is closer to what, in theory, you get in the American model, where secularism acts as a referee, which says you're allowed to come in, you're allowed to come on the pitch as long as you play by the same rules. And the more programmatic the form of secularism you get, the more likely it seems that you're provoking a reaction from religious people. So Muslims in France is quite a good example, who feel as if they're citizens, but almost second-class citizens, because I'm allowed to bring much of my kind of political views, say, into public debate. When it comes to my religious views, actually, when it comes to things that matter most to me, be quiet. And that is not a recipe for a contented society. To be clear, the opposite is very messy. When you invite everyone onto the pitch, and then you've got to get this messy business of policing. There are no easy options here. But programmatic secularism, which is in many ways the kind of grandchild of the stuff we've been talking about, that has its challenges too.
And just to finish on, you mentioned Turkey and some other parts of sort of the Middle East. What is your analysis of worldwide trends in terms of belief? Have you seen any trends in the Arab world, the Muslim world, or in China? Are people becoming more religious, less religious? What's the picture?
So the only window I have onto that is through the very good polling of the Pew Forum in the US, which does an awful lot of work on a pretty global scale on this. As I remember as I understand from reading the most recent work on this, the general picture is the world's becoming more religious, not radically more, but that the trends in the West, or at least in Europe, towards some more secular beliefs are not replicated worldwide. But there are lots of complexities to this. Wherever you go in the world, religious people have more children than non-religious people, and conservative religious people have more children than liberal religious people. Okay. So just demographically, the ground is shifted towards religion. Having said that, a lot of those people who are more inclined to have children live in lower economically developed countries, and all the signs from those historically has always been that the more economically developed you become, the less religious the fewer children you have.
Okay.
Then you have these massive questions about how many Christians are there.
So there's a confounding factor there.
There's a flip factor, that's right. There are 100 million Christians in China, perhaps 80 million. I don't know how many Muslims, but certainly it's the tens of Muslims. How the Chinese state deals with seemingly growing religiosity in its population. That has flip-flopped and
of course.
frozen quite severely in the last 2 years or so.
Yeah.
1.45 billion people in China, that's a massive factor. Yeah. So the safest option is to say, I don't know. but that, you know, it doesn't seem as if any side is going to win out in all this. We seem to be moving towards a state of more or less permanent pluralism, but one that looks very different in different places.
And it's just a question of how we embrace that, whether we try and stoke a conflict in our societies or whether we actually try and embrace that pluralism, I guess.
Yeah, living with difference is really hard. It's really hard trusting systems and other people to be fair and trusting systems to be fair and trusting other people to to live alongside them, even if they might have deep ideological differences to you, let alone harden that up to different national differences or like Samuel Huntington, different civilizational differences.
Yeah.
It's really telling, isn't it, that 2-3 generations ago, if you asked people in America who they wouldn't want their children to marry, the answer was someone of a different ethnicity. This is a massive oversimplification. Generation after that, it would be someone of a different religion. Today, it's someone of a different political perspective.
Yeah, that's the dividing line now, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Republicans do not want their kids to marry Democrats and vice versa. I simplify.
Yeah.
Point being that difference will work its way out in whatever arena we find ourselves in. We've always got to recognise that there are goods to difference, but also challenges to it as well.
Okay, so we bashed complexity earlier, but I think it is the one to watch.
Safest way to end. It really is.
Nick, thank you very much for your time. You can see Nick Spencer's latest work on BBC Radio. We'll put a link in below in his 3-part radio series, "The Secret History of Science and Religion," full title. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, Rational Religion. Give us a like and comment what you thought or what you think on these topics below. But until next time, peace be upon you.
Peace be on you.